happy to introduce our panel moderator. We're so pleased to have Susan with us this morning, who's art historian and curator and former senior curator of collections and exhibitions at the Guggenheim Museum. So I'll now turn it over to Susan.
Thank you. I'll just introduce the rest of our speakers so that everyone has an understanding of their background. Immediately to my left, I have a little bit of dyslexia, so, is Emanuela Tarizio, who's the gallery director at Tommaso Brothers Fine Art in London. Her role focuses significantly on research, and she's co-authored most of Tommaso Brothers' catalogs since joining the gallery 5 years ago. Previously, she worked in another gallery in London and was a graduate intern at Christie's Old Masters Department, also in London. She holds BA and MA degrees from the Courtauld and is a specialist in Northern Renaissance painting and architecture and sculpture patronage in early Renaissance Rome. Next to her is Pierre Terjanian, who's the Arthur Schultzberger curator in charge of the Department of Arms and Armor at the Metropolitan, which encompasses over 14,000 objects created over a 1,000-year period from Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. He's been curatorially engaged with arms and armor for nearly 20 years and joined the Met approximately 6 years ago. And finally, we have Elizabeth Zanzer, who's an art curator and the principal of ESK Art Limited Liability Company, an LLC, which is an art advisory firm providing curatorial and collection management services to private collectors, corporations, and museums for over 30 years. Her firm focuses on the development, maintenance, and in-depth research of collections. She is also the vice president of the APAA, the Art Association of Professional Art Advisors, an organization whose members represent the highest standards of professional practice. So I thought what we would do today, which is really intended as a conversation among the four of us, I thought since the topic is on vetting, which seems to be a rather unknown activity among art fairs, I thought I would begin by just giving a brief introduction as to what vetting is and what the process is, without going into too much detail, because that's kind of the nature of the beast. And I think it'll be an interesting talk because we really blend a number of art histories coming from objects through paintings and into and across time. So the definition of vetting is really to make a careful and critical examination of an object. It's simply confirming that the object is what it purports to be. Essentially, it's a background check or a seal of approval. And it is really based on the available information presented by the dealers. And it certainly requires knowledge. The vetters themselves are trained art professionals ranging from curators to conservators with years of specialization within a particular area of art history. They are unpaid to ensure no bias. So before a fair opens, the dealers leave their stands and the vetters come on. They usually have about 1 to 2 days to look at every object within their area. And I think each team, specialized team, consists of between 4 to 10 people. They bring a considerable amount of technical art history knowledge, the historical importance of an artwork, the importance of the artwork within the artist's oeuvre, its condition, and its provenance in making their decisions about whether the work is what it purports to be. Occasionally, if there are questions of disagreement, they may ask for a label to be changed, or they may in fact ask for further information to back up an attribution, or even for an object to be removed. And in that case, appeal can be made and a discussion can happen between the two, the dealer and the vetter, in order to come to a conclusion about the artwork itself. So in many ways, vetting is what cements the reputation of an fair, and it's done to instill the buyer confidence. And TEFAF is a leader in this area. They ensure the quality, the authenticity, and the condition of every artwork offered for sale. That said, there are no guarantees with every artwork. And this is where connoisseurship, the collector, the vetter, and the dealer, all of whom participate in that, come into play. And I think as we go along, we'll talk a little bit about what connoisseurship is and what it means in the context of vetting a fair and looking in general at objects. So my first question is actually to Emanuela, is how can the fair's vetting process enrich our knowledge of a work of art?
Thank you, Susan. So as you said, vetting is very much about looking at the authenticity of a work, at its quality, and ensuring that a due diligence is made, given sort of based on all the information by the art dealer. But also, vetters at TEFAF can use technical examination, technical analysis, which I think is particular to TEFAF fairs.
Yes, it is. It's the only fair that has that.
And in our case, at Tommaso Brothers, a couple of years ago, at TEFAF Maastricht, we had a very interesting exchange with the vetting that has actually enriched our understanding of a work. We had bronze, a little sort of medium-sized bronze Bacchus after the Michelangelo one, the marble in the Bargello in Florence, by a Florentine sculptor called Foggini, who was active to sort of the late 16th, early 18th century. And we bought this bronze as we thought it was absolutely fabulous. And we worked on its attribution, actually. We compared it to other works by Foggini. We looked at, what Foggini was doing, what he was looking at in a period during his life, and sort of that made sense with the Michelangelo model. So we came to the attribution. But the interesting thing is that the surface had a sort of red lacquer on it, which we couldn't quite pin it down, sort of the origin of it. But to the sort of trained eyes, especially of the two partners of the gallery, Dino and Raffaello, who've been looking at bronzes for over 20 years, that it looked sort of, shall we say, the right thing. So we didn't clean it, we didn't do anything to it, and we took it to the fair, and actually it was quite funny because when you come back to your stand, if there is any comments, you find them on a piece of paper that the vetting leaves, sort of saying, relabel or something. But when we came back, the bronze wasn't there. And so...
what happened to it?
We were quite sort of surprised. And shortly afterwards, one of them, sort of vetting, came back to our stand holding the bronze sort of with a big smile on his face, saying, "This is amazing, I just borrowed this for our TEFAF vetting video because the surface is absolutely great. And, to see an original red lacquer like this, like extensive traces of it, is fantastic. This is exactly what we want, like an uncleaned, non-repatinated bronze. This is really exciting." And we were sort of like, okay. I mean, at first we were really happy to have the bronze back. But also it was really exciting because then they showed us the images that they'd taken of the surface, sort of like with microscopy. So very zoomed in, and it kind of shows you the surface, and they pointed out how they could tell that this was the original lacquer, sort of organic to it, not added, it wasn't residue from something else. And that sort of opened up a whole sort of thinking about how bronzes were patinated, how they were used. If you look at period paintings, you see bronzes that are red, which you rarely see today. So that was really a very exciting moment for us, and it did enrich our understanding of what we had, which I think is something that happened at TEFAF because of the level of the vetting committee, of what the vetting offers.
Well, it's true that TEFAF is the only fair that brings technical art history into the vetting process, and it obviously in that case very much worked in favor of it. Pierre, are there times when you've encountered works that have the wrong kind of condition, or conditions that make you ask questions in different ways and bring further research to your looking?
It very much depends where you find those works, but of course you run into works that do not have the condition that you want. And this is where connoisseurship plays an important role. I didn't look up the definition of connoisseurships is very much mine, but I would say that I think of connoisseurship as a way of profiling an object. So when you come across an object and you want to know if it's unique, you want to know if it's part of a population, how does it fit into the cosmos of these objects in terms of not just of condition, but execution? Is it an early example of the type? Is it a later one? What are the characteristics? Does it have an interesting provenance? Was it shown in a world fair? So you try to recover all this information. And condition, in my opinion, working with arms and armor, which is a very specific field, but oftentimes different media. The essential question is, what can you reasonably expect from an object of a certain age and certain class? And it's all relative to the nature of the object. So we're very, very demanding on a firearm that would be from the 19th century. We're not nearly as demanding as a Bronze Age object for obvious reasons when it's archaeological object.
Have you ever bought a work of art whose quality is not perhaps the highest? Because sometimes I find in connoisseurship the object still begins to tell you something, and you accept the fact that its quality, as you just said, with even earlier objects, isn't perhaps the...
Well, we would do that when we know that the last example of its kind sold or changed hands 100 years ago, and this is not the second best, but it is the only chance to represent. But that's a decision we do very carefully. An example of something like that is our department made prototypes for World War I and World War II for the US troops, and we decessioned all of these helmets that were forged in our department, those templates, as being not works of art. So we said, this is not works of art, that's all we do, and we decessioned them all. We've been buying them back because it's part of the institutional history. Condition is far from optimal. This is around the margins of what we do, but it was just, so that was an example of where we would compromise. If it is something we want to display in the galleries, condition remains quintessential.
And Elizabeth, in your work, how does quality really affect, or the condition affect your decision about certain purchases?
Well, it can, and again, it depends on what it is. I mean, we have to assess it, and sometimes we find something that, let's say, was treated for a condition, and we might want to find out what actually was done to it, you know, if there are records for that. Sometimes things are reversible. So we really have to look at the whole picture, and just like Pierre said, you know, if it's something that fits within the context of the collection, and it is clearly the last possibility of having something like that, and it's something we've been after, we might go for it with the understanding about the condition.
I think of that.
There are a lot of variables.
Yes, there are. And I'm thinking in particular of that interesting story of the elbow that went through the Picasso Le Rêve. And the restoration of that work in a period of time actually brought the price up.
Yeah.
Which was
well,
an extremely unusual situation.
I'd like to talk about two recent purchases that I think would shed light on condition. We prefer the objects that are in poor condition when they were found in poor condition, and to control the conservation. We are actually willing to overpay to make sure that the object, we have absolute control of how we're going to conserve it.
How does a collector, though, make decisions like that?
That's a very difficult decision to make, because you need to know you have access to the skills to conserve it properly. We happen to have people that in our department who are tailored for the task. And
Elizabeth, for you who work with private collectors, how do you bring people to that?
Oh, we call people like Pierre. No, but it's very important. It's something we talked about earlier. Relationships are very, very important. And if you're collecting in a certain realm, it's wonderful to have relationships with other people who either collect in that realm, institutions. You get to know who the conservators are. And we go to the institutions when we're looking for a conservator in a certain area. And if we don't know of one, we go to the institutions with which we're involved to inquire who would be the best person and how should this be handled. We approach these things very, very carefully. We don't rush to conserve anything. And also on behalf of the collections I work with, it is preferable to leave things alone at times rather than
original condition can tell us everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pierre, you had something else
It can
to
be culturally induced. So, for example, an armor that would be conserved in Japan, they would typically replace all the lacing if the lacing is failing, and if the lacquer has cracked, it becomes entirely relacquered. So that is considered perfectly appropriate, and museums do that in Japan. Whereas if this object is from the 17th century and it has textiles from the 17th century, even though they're damaged, we want to minimize the intervention and retain as much of the character and the age of the object. And that's culturally induced. This is our approach. It's not the approach of everyone. And I think private collectors could similarly disagree on what makes the object appropriate for their collection. But at least we have the freedom to decide and how to go about it.
It's interesting, in 20th century, it's sometimes accepted by certain artists would send, particularly artists working in monochrome, such as, say, Ellsworth Kelly. He was very comfortable sending his work to a conservator who would fully resurface something.
And we know what happened with those.
Yes. That's true. And Reinhardt is another example of where works have been fully resurfaced and, in fact, are no longer really considered by the artist hand. In your field, as a dealer, how much conservation work goes on before you bring works to a fair or offer them for sale?
It really depends. I mean,
I realize that's a loaded question.
No, it's fine. It really depends. It depends on what the state of the object is. As Pierre said, we in our field, obviously, we have the experience. We've looked at many objects, so we have the experience to and the contacts and the relationship with museums, with the conservators, to ask them, what do you think? What do you think of the condition of this? Do you think that we should clean this? Do you think that this should be conserved or not? I think that, and again, it's also culturally induced. I think that there is a preference today, as opposed to, say, to give an extreme example, in the 19th century, to not, repaint or conserve, to sort of do as little as possible to a work. Sometimes that's not always possible. And in terms of acquiring based on condition, condition obviously plays an important part, but if we see something that, for instance, we've been after for a long time, or we know a client has been after for a long time, or do we just love it for what it is, for its provenance, for its subject, if it's a portrait, it's a particularly important figure, you put all these elements together and you make a decision, an informed decision. That's the most important thing. And at a fair like TEFAF, obviously there's experts who can ascertain the condition of something, and if they're not sure, they can request condition report. So.
Well, it's you may be wondering why we're talking so much about quality and condition, but these factors really very much play into connoisseurship, and I think that was one of the things that among the four of us we talked about really wanting to focus on today, rather than the actual vetting process. So I think let's keep talking about our experiences with connoisseurship and what that means, and what is an eye, how do you develop it, is it inherent or is it trained, and the amount of research that goes into being a connoisseur.
I think, we've, as you said, we've talked about condition and quality a lot, but it's being, a connoisseur, so to speak, or just a, scholar and expert, is not just about condition. It's not just about quality. It's very much about research as well. And you research provenance, you research the artist, and sometimes as dealers we buy something before we've had time to do all the due diligence. And there's another example that's actually quite interesting, which we have on the stand now here at TEFAF. So we saw a little marble bust of a girl. It came to our attention, and we looked at it and we thought, well, the quality looks really good, and we thought about the artist. We thought, Lorenzo Bartolini in this particular case, a Florentine, early 19th century sculptor. And we then asked experts about, and actually one of them pointed us in the right direction and said, look into his collection of plasters, his studio plasters. There's a plaster of that same marble. So we then knew that he'd done it, that obviously that it was his, and that who the sitter was, who is she's Princess Maria Leopoldina Metternich, the daughter of Chancellor Metternich of sort of Congress of Vienna fame, but there was another marble by him of the same subject, a bigger one, which we discovered sort of as we went along with our research. So it's kind of like, oh right, so we bought this. There is another one. How are the two connected? How can we make sense of the fact that he did two? And so I continued with the research, and then I found a letter that she herself had written to her father, so the sitter had written to her father, that said, and actually I should add that the other bust is bigger than ours. It's a sort of life size, and ours is slightly smaller. And so the letter said, dear father, I have sat for Bartolini again today, and you'll be pleased to know that the bust is coming along very nicely. But as I'm sure you'll understand, my husband much prefers the small bust to the big bust. So we're kind of like, it's a sort of eureka moment, right? This all makes sense. And so I think this sort of shows how connoisseurship and sort of thorough provenance, or sort of, research in documents and sources can come together and make sense. So,
and all of that's done in advance of bringing works to a fair. I mean, Elizabeth and Pierre, as you're buying and acquiring, and a fair environment is not as frenzied as, say, as an auction, but it's still meant to happen more quickly. And research is something that certainly takes time. How do you go about applying that in considering acquisitions?
I have the wonderful privilege of having colleagues. So I have bought objects at fairs and TEFAF in particular, and I would immediately radio, there's a time difference when you're in Maastricht, but immediately send assignments. Check this catalog, this rings a bell, have you seen something like that? So it's, first of all, in my case, not a solitary exercise, and I would say you cannot develop connoisseurship by yourself by just looking. It's ultimately identifying the important questions, deciding for yourself who are the people that will provide a constructive discussion of, and maybe there are no answers, but just exploring the implications that each of these questions raises. And you can come to half-truths that are enough to make a decision. So for example, I bought a powder flask at TEFAF Maastricht a few years ago, where when I saw it, I knew it was important. I could tell from the point of view of workmanship and design. It was carved antler, and it had a beautiful scene of David terracing Goliath. I couldn't tell the school, I could tell it was 16th century, and immediately started thinking with my phone and looking on my phone for information, and it was possible to identify it was part of a very small group, and where some of them ended up, including in the Medici Armory. And already I knew I was onto something. And within a day or so, I had enough bits of information. Condition was for me to see, but everything else was coming together. So it meant I didn't stop looking at everything else in the fair. And that's an investment that's very difficult to do when you know there is potentially more. But ultimately, it's something you develop as you engage in conversations. Even objects are in museums, you need to know why they are in the state that they are today. There's so much more than what you can see. And so research is essential, and you cannot prepare for everything. I think it's more the reflex of doubting.
What's your approach?
So I try to find out ahead of time what's being shown by certain gallerists. We try to already perhaps target certain things, certain objects at a fair like this. And we also try to do as much research as possible. We ask, of course, the gallerists to provide whatever information they have. We assess that. We do go further with certain experts in the different fields and ask them for their opinions. And I also have a team that I work with on my staff, and we also have a provenance researcher. So in cases where that's needed to go check out certain documents, that's done. We do it to the best of our ability. Because the connoisseurship, you know, the word connoisseurship, it means that you can kind of critically assess maybe what you're looking at and maybe decide who did it or a time period, but you need much more than that.
In my experience, buying through fairs, we also had the same opportunities to know in advance, but because I was buying mostly for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, and those decisions were conditional based upon the research. The acquisition was conditional. So works of art were mostly placed on hold and not simply just bought outright. And I think that's an important distinction to make, so that that research could be conducted, including market analysis. That was also, especially for that particular museum, rather essential. So I have a question also about quality and connoisseurship, and whether sometimes we can be fooled and occasionally acquire a fake, and what happens then. How do you treat that within your own collection or within your museum collection? And as a dealer, what do you do? Do you keep it off the market?
Yes, you certainly do. I think obviously the goal is not to, of
course,
to be fooled, but
it can happen.
Mistakes absolutely mistakes absolutely happen, and when you buy something that you realize is not what you thought it was, I think that the important thing is, as I said, to sort of, you don't put it on the market. If you know, and we do tests, and I must say we had rarely cases of you do a technical test, then somebody else does the same test, like another lab, and the results are different. That's very tricky. At that point, you just, you take it off the market. You don't do anything. But what I was going to say about sort of, making mistakes is that you learn from them. It's so important to look both at the really good things, but also at the not really good things, because then that's when you can start learning about quality and sort of,
well, that's how you train
the
your
surface
eye.
or
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So mistakes, you learn from your mistakes.
It's interesting because I'm working mostly in modern and contemporary, and occasionally in-depth conservation analysis will be done on an object, and you can read some that actually tell you nothing, even though they have, and that's something that I think requires a lot of experience, working with conservators and understanding who is giving you the correct information despite the scientific analysis that's being done. Elizabeth, have you ever had that experience where?
Oh yes, or you read the condition report, and when you get the piece, you wonder what that person was thinking, because now you're looking at it and you almost feel like you're looking at a different object. So I've had that. The other thing that comes up is you might get a certificate of authenticity from a known source, and everything seems fine, and then the object is still not fine. And sort of in the midst of that right now with an object.
So time is really of the essence. I mean, because it allows you to continue to think and to ponder and to research and to try to properly authenticate a work for acquisition.
Yeah, but what happens when, this is a whole other conversation, who are the experts and who has the final word? Because you can have someone say, no, it's absolutely by that artist or that designer, and then it turns out it's not, and then what? I mean, so that happens a lot too. Another expert comes along and has a different opinion.
That's a whole nother topic, and could be a very good panel conversation for next year's TEFAF. But I want to go back to how fakes are handled in your world, in both of your worlds. Okay.
Well, I can just, so to answer that question, because I represent collections, private rather than public or institutional, we try to go back to the source of where it was purchased and deal with them to the best of our ability. Luckily, it doesn't happen very often.
And Pierre, you probably have a very different approach as a collecting institution.
Well, I'm sorry to report we haven't acquired any fakes recently, but we do have our share, and we keep them for a number of reasons. First of all, they tell us about who we were, what we knew then, and how come we believed that the object was right. And then second, we're reluctant to let them go because they could get a new lease on life and within a decade or so reappear transformed, not exactly the same with the reattribution. So we tend to hold to all of the objects we consider dubious or outright fakes. Actually, we research them, so we try to pin down who made it and when, and we still work on fakes that we acquired 100 years ago. And we occasionally acquire great fakes. That's all, again, on the margins. It's not what we invest in. But when we see one perfect example of the work of a well-known forger, they often are very cheap because no one wants that. And for us, for our study collection, as a point of reference, we want the very best one that was ever made by this forger. So we have, within the last 10 years, gotten a few excellent small objects that are part of a study collection. It's the online cataloging that makes it very difficult to catalog fakes, because we used to call them 19th century, but that doesn't make them fake. It makes fake for us. So when were they actually made, and what was the intent? Were there copies that then were sold to deceive, but they were originally made as copies? So in our mind, that's two different kinds of objects. And the information systems ask the really hard questions. So it's a work in progress.
I think, it's interesting what you said about how do you catalog it? Because, so for instance, in the field of sculpture, there's a couple of well-known artists that were also forgers, but were they? Because I'm thinking about Bastianini, as a Florentine in the late 19th century, who made terracotta busts, they're very good, just like the ones that are sort of like early 16th century, even late 15th century Florence. I'm thinking maybe Rossellino or even marble like Desiderio. And, I think he was called out as a forger even during his lifetime. But he said, I'm not. I'm just doing these. Sometimes he sort of put his initials in a corner and said, I'm just doing these as works of art, and somebody else is selling them as fakes. So I understand how do you catalog them, even if you acquire a fake, what we see today is a fake. At the time, the artist, it's quite tricky. It's definitely not. But I'm just thinking about artists back in the day, and Alcido Sena is another one. It's very interesting.
I think one of the most interesting exhibitions I ever saw was at the British Museum maybe 25 years ago, called Fake, and it went everything from teacups to baseballs to Egyptian mummies, and it was incredibly fascinating and informative, because fakes do exist everywhere, and we live in a world now where it's a little bit more tolerated in some ways, certainly not in the art world, but handbags, shoes, things of that nature. So I think the knowledge as art historians, curators, dealers that we bring to an artwork is very essential to ensuring its authenticity. Pierre, you have something further to add? No,
I just remember the first head of our department, Bashruddin, bought outright an object that he thought was the greatest coup of his career, and then when he found out it was a fake, he actually kept it on his desk to the rest of his career as a memento of his, of his failure to understand what it really was. And I think about this a lot because I'm in a very narrow field where there are not many scholars, and you want to nurture them. And one way that you need to develop your expertise is by looking not just at what's real, but what has been compromised and what has been altered and what is fake. And there are very few collections where you can gain that kind of knowledge. So we have that. It's a very small group, but it's also, in our opinion, the essence of connoisseurship is to put the real and the imitation side by side, And frankly, there are cases where to this day, if we didn't have the documentation, we would still be wondering. So it's also a lesson in humility, which I think is important as you go out and you collect.
I'm thinking about Modigliani because he's an artist who died young and had no family to ensure his legacy. And there have been a number of works that are questionable that have come forward. There's a lot of dispute, even among dueling catalog raisonnés. And how do works like that get really sort of identified and put into one group, let's say, so that you can really begin to understand who was faking and how it was done, and then how that affects the market in many ways. So, Elizabeth, do you have some comments on that?
I think that if we're looking at the market, we see it's affected the prices in a very positive way, because the Modigliani prices have gone very high. Because when they're presented on the market, they're presented as being authentic, and that these are the ones that have been proved to be authentic. I don't know, maybe another scholar says they're not.
Well,
but they talked about a whole group of works in a museum that were fake, and then the Tate did an exhibition last year and claimed that everything in the exhibition had been vetted and was actually by Modigliani.
Yes, it was all works in Chironi, which was the Italian who wrote
Right.
the last catalog
That's
raisonné.
right.
But
Yeah.
also the Tate, I think quite rightly, took a further step by initiating a technical study of a number of works. And then this is so essential
They did.
For artists who have had kind of questionable activities
Right, and that
surrounding
really
them. Not that they did it, but others around them.
Anyway,
Anyway,
I had at the time I had a personal experience with that, because there was a collector who approached me, who had been asked for the loan of 2 Modiglianis to that exhibition, and it was a collecting family that never did loans at all, and I helped them with the loans, and they were asked if their paintings could be examined technically, and they said, "What should we do?" I said, "Absolutely. You want to do that."
it's an opportunity.
Exactly. So they were very grateful for that experience and to know that the works they had were correct.
So all of those elements, knowledge, technical art history, looking, all of that goes into connoisseurship, vetting, et cetera. And I hope we've touched on some of that for you today. I think we're going to open this up now to questions from the audience, if there are any. Linda's coming with a microphone.
Hi, thank you for this talk. My question is, I know a few years ago that the Metropolitan Museum put on that exhibit at the Burr Building, Unfinished, where they were displaying works of art that were considered by the artists themselves even to be imperfect, unfinished, as the title was. And then certainly within the last couple of weeks in this city, we've seen the destruction of a Banksy that was sold, for all that money. And so my question is, aside from things that are forged, how do all of you interpret and take on works that are art in their own right, but could arguably be considered to be imperfect?
I think we touched a little bit on that by when Pierre spoke about not always, occasionally taking on or purchasing works that were not of perhaps the highest quality. But I actually want to answer something about the unfinished aspect. I think that's quite different. It's nothing to do with fakes at all. I mean, it's just a point in an artist where he decides to leave a work on the canvas or I think that's a very, very different topic, and I think that exhibition attempted to address it.
But I'm happy to answer the question in as much as I can. If you were to buy a marble torso from the classical antiquity and we're missing the arms and there is no record of what those arms might have looked like, would you want to have the arms put back, or is the object perfect for what it is? We have in our collections objects that would be considered imperfect in the sense that they're not complete. But at the same time, if there's no knowledge of what the state of completeness would have been and they have no equivalent elsewhere, we believe that they're very good objects and we keep them. So we don't take issue with the fact that an object may be incomplete. Unfinished objects almost do not exist in my field. We didn't participate in the exhibition. Our department didn't find any unfinished objects. But there are some in other collections, and it so happens, that's usually when an order is canceled, the client didn't pay, and the objects have survived somehow. So it's not the artist's intention, it's economic circumstances which are a lot less exciting.
Hello. I wanted to know what criteria govern the amount of due diligence that you would do on an item, and do you also have a minimum level of due diligence that you would carry out on any item regardless, and what would that involve?
I would say the answer is yes. There is a minimum amount of due diligence carried out on any item, and that would involve checking things like provenance key, checking it out, checking any bibliographic or exhibition history that's provided on an object to make sure that the works are actually, they were included in the exhibition or reproduced in those publications as best we could. Getting hard documentation is helpful, and certainly have to make sure that the work, if it came from abroad, was properly exported, imported, all those things. Of course, that doesn't apply to everything. You can buy a contemporary work of art, and you're just buying it out of an artist's first show. But there we still look at condition and whatever applies to that particular possible acquisition.
Using the Bottolini bust as a reference point, when you find the letter that allows you to say this is authentic, when you prepare the delivery to a buyer, does that travel with the object as part of the provenance? Do you physically provide them with evidence of the...
In this particular case, no. The letter is in the National Archive in Prague, so I can't take it with me. But we obviously provide the reference to it, and you know, it's published by other scholars, the letter itself. But obviously, actually, sometimes it happens that you have documentation that is original to the commission, to the period when something was made, that has always traveled with it. Sometimes you find pieces of paper on the back of a painting, or they sort of accompany something. And in that case, definitely you can show the original. In this particular case, as I said, it's in a public archive, so I can't.
And if you do have that kind of documentation, do you provide physical copies of?
Yeah.
And do you have a way of authenticating that those references that are traveling with the work are in fact not fake?
Well, that's very interesting.
Actually, I mean, an archival, if you take a copy from an archive, they stamp it with their stamp. So that would provide the originality to that particular document.
And I think for the documents that, as I mentioned, like have traveled with an object for many years, it's obviously different. With paper, I know that you can ask experts to date the paper. Paper is not something you can do a technical analysis, like say bronze, and find out the alloy and what the components it has. But I think it's also, and also we have to remember that these documents are not everything. They, you know, even in the case of the Bartolini, the letter confirmed something that we already we had researched and we believed in already, the quality of the bust, and the fact that, you know, Bartolini does busts that are smaller than life size. He does repeated compositions. It wasn't, the letter alone is not what sort of made us reach that conclusion. It actually confirmed a conclusion that we'd already reached. So, and I think that's part of connoisseurship, scholarship, whatever you want to call it. You're not just basing yourself on technical analysis or on documents. You're doing your own due diligence. You look, and you assess quality, and then you have everything else, which it's sort of the greater picture, shall we say.
It can be difficult for a private collector to find the time and gain access to all the documentation you would like to have to do provenance research. But I think provenance research is so focused on the legality that we sometimes forget about collection history. In the process of reconstructing the chain of provenance, you often come across commentaries, attributions, so much more that can make the object more exciting, that gives it other layers of interest. And I have almost always found something new by just verifying a published provenance that was lost somehow in the process of editing or transmitting the chain of provenance. So it's always rewarding, even if you're handed the entire provenance with the copies, to go back and confirm. We speak with every vendor or every owner who is still alive when we acquire an object, in as much as we can identify that person, to know more. And I found it more rewarding than time-consuming. It's worth doing. It's not always feasible, unfortunately.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, I'm working as a private dealer and advisor. I often recommend to clients to, when they're looking for artwork, to work with quote-unquote reputable dealers. But of course, after the fall of Knoedler and many others, I myself am disturbed about what constitutes a reputable dealer. Have organizations like the Art Dealers Association and others done anything to increase the oversight and vetting of the dealers that are members of their organizations?
I'm not sure I can speak to that. It's certainly something that should happen, but I also think that the fact that these events, if that's the correct word, have come to light, have made us all begin to question. And in that questioning, as you start to share with your colleagues and other knowledgeable and people whom you trust, that you can begin to develop whether you feel comfortable or not with that particular dealer. It's tricky. I'm not answering your question fully because I don't know, but it should be done for sure, but I don't think that these organizations have taken that on yet. Do you all have anything to add on that?
I cannot answer the question either, but I would say, in my experience, the dealers have been very transparent. Have usually been the ones that kept their reputation. The ones that are willing to give access, in confidence, to information that they have about where the object has been and in what state it was, the kinds of restoration that are done. When you have somebody who wants to walk away, when you're starting asking the hard questions, then we must have a problem. But in general, I would say that is a pretty good indication. It's nothing like vetting. It's just let the buyer beware and be proactive about soliciting answers.
Any further questions?
So I do have a further question just about the previous question about dealers and vetting of dealers. To what degree does the rigorous vetting at a fair like TEFAF here in New York and TEFAF Maastricht help all of you, I guess, as curators and as art advisors, have a level of comfort or confidence in not only the objects being presented, but the dealers who are included?
I think it does provide an assurance, but I think all of us continue to do our own research. It's imperative, really. Wouldn't you all agree? I mean,
I would. I think you do have some higher level of assurance, definitely, depending on who the dealer is and the kind of fair, if we're talking about this fair, kind of fair it is. But at the same time, you really have to assess it for yourself and really do your own work to make that determination.
And briefly, there's no question that the vetting adds to the value of the works that are made available. At the same time, we may be the ones who need it the least. We buy oftentimes in unvetted environments directly from a private collection, and we don't need it as much because we don't know everything. We consult extensively internally and externally as we make decisions, but we are unusually well equipped, having reference library, archives in the department is over 100 years old with correspondence, and we sometimes find the same object. It was seen in the 1920s and so forth. This is not the typical situation in which the buyer is.
Just 1 second.
Thank you. On Wednesday, I attended a blockchain conference, and this is all so new and somewhat crazy because it's so new. But the idea of taking all the vetted information, the history, and placing it, democratizing in some way that information so it's accessible, may be a direction that is coming. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's really a helpful step. There's no question. I think that it's a really good idea. But I think you still need to assess it and do your own research, and because it's not ironclad, you don't know. It's only what they know. And they're posting.
It could be that they're putting forth fake documents. I mean, that's always a possibility. So you really do owe it to yourself and to the artwork to do the research.
And I think that there's also a matter of interpretability. So you can have all the documents at hand, but then you need an expert sometimes to interpret them. So you have technical analysis. You can have the sort of printed report, but I think then you need the knowledge of a person, not just of a chip, to sort of then take you through what the technical report means. So I think you still need the sort of human factor, so to speak. But obviously the fact that information is available is important.
Well, we collect actively. We buy maybe 40 objects a year or so, and some are small and some are large in price. But I realize we have a lot of long ongoing relationship with particular dealers, auction houses, and sometimes even collectors, and this is based on trust and repeated good outcomes, positive outcomes. So sometimes certain information needs to be confidential until the interest is so serious that they're willing to tell you who was the previous owner before you get something that is enough to know where it's going. But ultimate transparency has commercial implications, and there are lots of rivalries if something has changed hands recently about what the markup is and so forth. Those commercial considerations are very important, but I do think that it would be a problem for the marketplace if you were to have absolute transparency. I think you may need a stage transparency where you have enough at the first place, and maybe for the interested buyers who are going to actively solicit information, more coming. I have the same thing when somebody sells something to us. We do not want to act like we're advertising necessarily who we're buying from. And sometimes I have even the vendors are asked to remain private. And we want to be transparent. We're not hiding provenance. The information exists in our files. We put it online. But it raises this question of what is the best compromise that satisfies the buyers and allows the marketplace to function effectively. And I think there's no steady answer. That depends obviously on the environment and the works and so forth. So I would just be a little cautious about sort of the idea that this is just a science.
I think it will be interesting to see. I think the idea also of the blockchain is that if whoever buys a work of art, they get all the information, and then it's up to them if they want to register the work or not. It'll be interesting to see how many maybe private collectors do that.
So a developing field in many ways. So with that, I think could we just take one more question and then if we could go quickly. Thank you.
I live in New Orleans, and that $450 million Leonardo da Vinci was sold in New Orleans in a small auction house in 2005 for $10,000. So who's responsible for that?
Not sure we can answer that. We can talk a little bit about that afterwards. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed our panel this morning.
Thank you very much for coming. I would appreciate it if you'd keep looking at this brochure and see if there's really interesting programs, including at 2 o'clock today, one on World War I and its effect on art and artists. And we have a terrific panel also marking the centennial of the end of World War I, as probably some of us are aware of. I want to thank, and remember, this is live stream, so you can go back and look at it. So that's terrific, because I think this has been a fabulous conversation. Can we thank our wonderful panel one more time?